So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the B.R. Shenoy Memorial Lecture 2024 to be delivered by Professor Pravin Krishna of Johns Hopkins University. My name is Kumar Anand, and I will be your host this evening. Professor Bellikot Raghunath Shenoy was born in 1905 in the small Kerala village of Bellikot, one of 11 children of a poor farmer educated up to class 5. He ran away from home while a schoolboy to join the Indian independence movement, where he was arrested carrying the flag. Jailed in the same prison as the educationist Madan Mohan Malviya, who had recently founded a university in Banaras. He finished high school and then traveled alone from Bellikot to Banaras, a 2,000-kilometer journey away in search of education. And given a scholarship up to his MA degree in economics, he won a scholarship to do a BSc economics at the London School of Economics, where one of his teachers was Professor Friedrich von Hayek. The young BRS at age 26 was among the first Indians to publish a scholarly economics article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1931. Appointed Indian representative to the IMF, he dissented from the then national emphasis on Soviet-style investment in heavy industry and instead of more appropriate employment-generating agriculture. He left his official positions to argue publicly for market-oriented policy reforms as the only road to prosperity for a poor country. Professor Shenoy was one of the few lonely voices from within the country who advocated for the 1991 kind of economic reforms. Abolition of the license permit Raj in 1991 changed everything. BRS spoke frankly on the corruption-inducing and production-distorting effects of import licenses in foreign trade. He wrote, "The Aladdin's lamp of import licensing produces fortunes as though from nowhere for a large community of importers and dealers in import licenses. How can corruption be prevented when an import license, a piece of paper which costs nothing but the signature of the concerned official to produce, authorizing the import of, say, copper, worth rupees 5 crore, fetches in the market over rupees 12 crores? Shenoy continues, as part of the policies of planning, we have brought about a pressurized expansion of industrial sector, import substitution to save foreign exchange, physical restraints on imports and exchange controls contributing to this process in no small measure. This industrial bulge has inevitably involved a colossal diversion of resources into new industries at the expense of traditional and export industries. After economic reforms, our foreign trade grew enormously, from 15.5% of GDP in 1990 to 27% in 2000, and it now stands at around 50% of India's GDP. Foreign trade is an essential component of our economic development. We are hence privileged to have B.R. Shenoy Memorial Lecture 2024 given by an expert on foreign trade, Professor Pravin Krishna. Dr. Pravin Krishna is Chung Young Distinguished Professor of International Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University and a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Krishna's fields of research interests are international economics, international political economy, the political economy of economic policy reform, economic development, and the political economy of India. His many scholarly articles have appeared in journals such as American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He's also the author of Trade Blocks, Economics and Politics, Cambridge University Press 2005, and co-editor along with Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagaria of Trading Blocks, Alternate Analysis of Preferential Trade Agreements, MIT Press 1999. Professor Krishna holds a bachelor's degree in engineering from IIT Bombay and a PhD in economics from Columbia University. He has previously held appointments at Brown University, University of Chicago, Princeton University, and Stanford University. He has also served as a consultant to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Before we begin with today's event, just a small housekeeping announcement. So today's memorial lecture will be followed by a question and answer session with the professor. So please write your questions in the chat or comment section on the Zoom or YouTube, wherever you're joining from. And with that, on behalf of the Economic Research Center, Mangalore, and the Center for Civil Society, New Delhi, it gives me great pleasure to invite our speaker, Professor Pravin Krishna, to speak on trade policy and India's structural transformation. Professor Krishna.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and a tremendous honor for me to give this year's B.R. Shenoy Memorial Lecture. I should start by saying that economists of my generation did not really have the opportunity to meet Dr. Shenoy or to hear him speak. And what we know of Dr. Shenoy, we know primarily through his writings and from what others have written about him. Nonetheless, the clarity and the prescience of Dr. Shenoy's writing in arguing against government interventions, his early warnings about the consequences of heavy-handed central planning, import substitution, and more broadly, the license Raj, make him an intellectual legend and a tremendous source of inspiration to all of us. I grew up in India in the 1970s and the 1980s, when the consequences of government intervention and heavy government intervention, which Dr. Shenoy had prophetically warned about, had become evident to everyone. Almost all of Dr. Shenoy's fears had come true. Indeed, his warnings were so accurate that the Nobel laureate Milton Friedman famously had written that Dr. Shenoy's writings sounded more like a retrospective description of what had happened rather than a forecast. This is the clarity with which he was able to see the future. Dr. Shenoy's boldness in making his case when it was unfashionable to do so, and his ability to speak the truth to power, show a singular intellectual and moral courage, making him a true hero. I'm deeply honored to be giving this lecture today. My topic is international trade, India's international trade and trade policy, an area in which Dr. Shenoy's warnings about the adverse impact of government interventions proved to be especially relevant. And I will be discussing this topic with reference to the challenges of the structural transformation of the Indian economy. So with this, let me share my slides. Here we are. And go to full screen. Okay. So trade policy, and India's structural transformation. And so as far as the outline for today's talk, I'd like to touch upon sort of three sets of issues. One is India's development trajectory, the transition from agriculture to industry and services. How has India done? How does it compare with other countries that have been through similar transitions? How does it compare with developed countries that have managed this transition successfully? And where does all this stand in relation to the employment challenges that India faces, arising in particular from India's demographics? So that's one piece about just a characterization about India's development trajectory. A second part, I will want to talk about India's international trade. So what does sort of India's trade look like, and the connection between these two issues, which is the development trajectory and international trade, will be clear in the sense that I will make the case that in order to address the employment challenges that India faces, greater participation in international trade, an expansion of India's export footprint, and a greater ability to leverage global markets is going to be completely key and essential. I'll talk about the reasons why India's export footprint remains still quite low, about how relative to its GDP share or relative to other countries in sort of similar stages of development, how India could be doing better with respect to its international trade. Talk about the particular reasons, including domestic policy, that have inhibited India's competitiveness and sort of induced an outcome that is less than optimal from this perspective, from the standpoint of trade, and then talk about India's trade policy options. In particular, when I discuss India's trade policy, I will want to do this with reference to essentially what's going on in the background. So what was the history of the multilateral system of which India is part? What were the trends in that system? How did India's own trade policy choices, how did they sync or not sync with what was going on globally, and where all of that stands with respect to our unilateral policies, bilateral choices with respect to trade blocs and so on, as well as multilateral sort of, where we stand with respect to the multilateral trade system, i.e. the World Trade Organization. Let me start with India's development trajectory. As I mentioned, we see here shares of the different sectors in overall output. We're talking about manufacturing, agriculture, services. And what one sees is that the share of agriculture over time has diminished, but remains reasonably high. The share of manufacturing, despite a tremendous number of economic reforms undertaken, let's say starting in the 1990s, both on the international margin as well as domestically, looks relatively flat, and services have expanded a bit. The transition out of agriculture, or kind of the share of agriculture in India's economy, looks, there's a kind of a particular contrast that is worth noting when one looks at the kind of the fraction of output relative to the fraction of the workforce that is taken up in this sector. So if one looks at output shares, one sees that agriculture accounts for about 15% of India's output, but you contrast that with the percentage of the workforce in agriculture, and that number is much larger. As you see here in the panel on the right, what you have here is a very substantial sort of share of the workforce that is in agriculture. We're talking about roughly 45% of the workforce producing only 15% of the output. What this points to is the very low relative sort of productivity of the agricultural sector relative to industry and services. And what you have here is a plot of the relative sectoral productivity. This is output per worker in industry as well as services, and the trends over time in relation to agricultural productivity. And you see that there's the output per worker productivity measure in industry and in services is several multiples, essentially around 3, 4, 5 times higher than what you have in agriculture, suggesting that agriculture perhaps is a sector that one wants to move workers out of one way or the other into the higher productivity industry, higher productivity services activities. This is a chart showing you sort of international comparisons. Where does India stand in relation to these other countries that one might loosely think of as comparator countries or countries whose economic performance we aspire to: Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and so on. And you see here that India's agricultural share is very high in 1996. It continues to be high in 2019, and certainly the highest among these comparator countries. And by contrast, what you have in sort of industry is that it's relatively low, and the only sort of, in terms of comparisons, you're doing better than Bangladesh in 1996, but slightly worse by the time you get to 2019, similar to Brazil, but worse than the other countries. So this is suggesting that India's transition, it's sort of somewhat, the movement out of agriculture into these other sectors has been somewhat stagnant relative to what has happened even in these other economies. Here's another comparison. This is now with the United States, just to get a sort of a broad historical perspective of what a developed country like the US, what were the transitions that it went through. These are sort of fractions of the labor force by sector. You see a very rapid decline in agriculture from close to 70% in the 1850s to something like 2, 3, 4% by the time you get to 2010. It's around 2% is the number currently. And you see that the time in which at which the US agricultural labor share was similar to what is where we are in India today, which is about 45%, was over 100 years ago. So you're talking about sort of 1890, 1880, 1900. This was the time period when you had a comparable sort of distribution of the labor force by sector in the agricultural sector. A different chart here showing you evolution of South Korean manufacturing. So if you go through the 1960s, 70s, and the 80s, and so on, you see a very rapid increase. The axis on the left is the share of manufacturing in total employment. And you see that they've gone up from the 10% or so, where India roughly is, to over 25% by the time they've peaked in 1990. And this is sort of the Korean growth miracle, the East Asian growth miracle, this was the nature of the increase in the labor force in manufacturing relative to essentially workers coming out of the agricultural sector into manufacturing in this very successful example. A different chart altogether showing you trends in sort of global value added manufacturing. In China, you see a very, very rapid increase, just, short few years between 2004, 2012, an extremely rapid rise in value added manufacturing. China, very vastly different from what we're seeing in India. So this is roughly the picture in terms of the necessary structural transformation, if that's what you could take away from these graphs that I've just shown. We're about 17% of the world's population, 3% of the world's output. One reason for this very low fraction is a very large fraction of our workforce that's used up in agriculture. And overall, the picture that what I take away from all of this is the very urgent need to transition workers out of low productivity agricultural jobs into higher productivity jobs in industry and services. This challenge and the need for this is all the more urgent given the demographic pressures in India. We're a very youthful country, over 30% population is less than 15 years of age, which suggests that the number of workers entering the labor force each year is going to be a very large number. And there's the important and urgent question of where these workers will be accommodated within the labor force. And we would certainly want to see more and more of that take place in industry and services and high productivity services. If agriculture is not going to be where these high wage jobs are created or relatively high wage jobs are created, one has to look for ways in which industry can potentially expand. And one very obvious solution here, and this is kind of a key part of the structural transformation discussion, is that this will have to come from India's ability to leverage global markets. So we still have a very small share of global markets. There is an enormous space out there for Indian manufacturing to be able to expand and supply to Indian services as well, of course. But international markets, exports are very low fraction of the export market as it currently stands, give us this sort of sense that there is tremendous potential there for job creation through export growth, given again that our export trade footprint is quite small. As you all probably know, India's share of merchandise exports was kind of really small number, maybe around 0.5% in 1990. And this is goods trade is just below 2% at this point, which tells you that there's kind of tremendous opportunity there still for us to grow. A comparison with China here is valuable, perhaps. These are the trends in terms of our global export shares. As you can see, India's export shares have grown over time, relatively modest increase from about 0.5% to close to 2%, as you see on this chart. But at the same time, a country like China went from a number that wasn't too much higher, maybe 2.5% or so, to something like 14, 15% of the world's export markets, truly having become the export sort of the manufacturing hub and export factory of the world. There's another angle through which one can compare India's trade performance with China, indeed with other countries, but I'll focus a bit here for the purposes of this discussion on the comparison with China. And this is through the composition of our exports. These different angles through which one can look at trade performance, not just looking at the aggregate outcomes, which tell you essentially the share of global markets, but these different angles through which one can look at it, particularly now, the slide that's on, looking at the composition of exports, indicate other issues with India's international trade, international kind of trade performance. And this has to do with, let's say, the composition of the Chinese export basket relative to India's export basket. So what you see here is the composition of China's exports. You see a very consistent pattern, sort of, and if you compare, this picture is for 2022, you see a lot of use in the exports that they produce of their low-skill labor. And over time, if I looked at the same sort of profile for the 2020s, 2010, the 1990, and so forth, you see very steady increase in skill and capital intensity over time. So essentially, as China went from being kind of a low skill abundant country to accumulating its capital to accumulating skill in the labor force, you see that they moved from having an export basket completely consistent with international trade theory, that they went from having an export basket that was sort of essentially made very good use of their low skilled workers and moved towards higher skill and more capital intensive exports over time. Same picture for India looks a little more haphazard. So we have an export basket that combines, on the one hand, natural resource exports, on the other hand, sort of skilled labor, semi-skilled labor, and so on. It does not quite reflect in the same way that China's export basket does, and the trend over time, which you're not seeing here, but the way that China's export basket trended over time in terms of their use of low-skilled labor. We don't necessarily see that in the Indian case. You could look more narrowly at the top 6 merchandise exports of China, and you see that same picture of consistency in the sense of their kind of labor force being employed in manufacturing, being employed in manufacturing, assembly, and so forth, trending over time. Again, a picture that you don't necessarily see here, but trending over time into more capital intensive and skill intensive production. Whereas the Indian profile for the top 6 merchandise exports are a little more haphazard again. Once again, a combination of kind of, natural resources, some low skill activity, some mid skill activity, and so on. You see a very similar picture if you look at sort of the top 2 merchandise exports for India and China in 2020. So my overall point over here is that very clearly reflected in India's export basket is the sort of the lack of the connection between the abundance of resources that we have, which is low skilled labor, and the nature of the products that we're producing and exporting. This has been commented upon by many experts in this field. This is, but nevertheless, a significant feature that one ought to recognize and sort of question as to why it is the case that we've been able to make less use of our abundant resources. The sort of theory would have you would suggest that we should, and that we would. Why have we not been able to do that in the Indian context in a manner that other very successful countries like China actually have? Yet another sort of angle through which one could sort of look at India's trade performance is through global value chains and India's participation in global value chains. So many countries have embraced the opportunities provided by global value chains, essentially where you have a great deal recently of production fragmentation taking place in the world, where it's not as if the intermediate inputs and the final goods are all necessarily all produced in the same country, but these are all produced in different places. Countries have been able to leverage their competitive advantage more effectively by specializing in different parts of a product's kind of production process, right? And this is especially true for countries in Asia, such as China, Japan, South Korea, and so on, which have very efficiently integrated their economies into these networks, and the networks in turn accounting for a significant fraction of global trade. How does India do with respect to share of global value chains? Unfortunately, this is actually quite small. So if you look at this kind of panel at the bottom here, the top panel really is talking just about a point we already discussed, share of world manufacturing exports. But the bottom panel is about the share of sort of, GPN, this global production network products or global value chain products within manufacturing exports. And you see that India's numbers are actually really quite small relative to some of these other countries like China, Korea, and some of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and so forth as well. So we've been less able to integrate into these global value chains, which are increasingly prominent, increasingly providing opportunities for countries that might be very, very good at producing one piece or one intermediate input that goes into a larger kind of production process without necessarily being good producing things all the way up to the final good. All of these point to sort of weaknesses and different ways of looking at India's trade performance. And overall, one knows it's very clear that sort of not so impressive trade performance comes from a combination of 2 things. One is competitiveness, The other is market access. So in general, in international trade, you want to do better. You think in terms of greater competitiveness. You think in terms of greater market access. And it should be clear that all the competitiveness in the world will probably not get you very far if you don't have any market access and you're shut out from the rest of the world. And all the market access in the world will probably not get you anywhere if you have a very low level of competitiveness. So in the Indian case, this has been subject to an enormous amount of discussion, and a number of prominent scholars over the years have written about this. Most recently, Professor Arvind Panagaria, Jagdish Bhagwati, various others have talked in great detail about the various issues that bedevil India's competitiveness in a manner that is relevant for international trade and international trade performance. I'll point out just a short list here, and I'll just focus on one of these. So there's a question of the scale of production, how large are Indian firms relative to firms in the rest of the world, what fraction of the Indian workforce is employed in low productivity firms, small low productivity firms. There's other questions more broadly about the business environment, labor regulations, challenges that they create for expansion of one's operations, for hiring more workers, land acquisition challenges, logistical challenges, and so forth on the one hand. So there's a series of reasons for why you have kind of domestic, in a sense, factors for kind of low performance. And one could ask this question about trade policy. How well have we integrated with the international trade system? What are the trends in the multilateral sphere? What have we done with respect to our bilateral agreements? And what's the story with respect to our multilateral, with respect to our unilateral policy choices? So I want to speak very briefly to this question of productivity and domestic competitiveness, which again is extremely key, of course, to our ability to do well and to expand and gain a greater foothold in terms of exports in international markets. But we'll focus most of my comments on the topic for today, which is trade policy against the broader global environment with respect to trade openness. I should mention, as I already have, that this work, I'm going to focus just on the issue of international scale. Much has been written about this. Professor Panagaria has been a very articulate contributor to this debate. Some of this work is based on sort of his analysis and the analysis of others, including Dr. Rana Hassan at the Asian Development Bank, who's done quite a lot to document sort of what it is that I'm about to talk about, which is the kind of the employment distribution, the size distribution of Indian firms, and why it matters from the standpoint of kind of Indian trade. So what you're seeing here is kind of Indian manufacturing and distribution of sort of a scale of the different firms and small, medium, large firms in India relative to China. And this is really very striking. You see that roughly 85%, is 84% over here. This is in 2005. Indian firms are employed so essentially employed less than 50 workers. And the fraction of firms that are could be considered in a sense large, employing 200 or more workers, is about 10%. This very big contrast with what you see in China, where you have only about 25% at the lower end of this distribution and over 50% large-scale firms. Why does this matter? There's a great productivity differential. If you look at output per worker in small firms relative to the large firms, you see this distribution. So these numbers presented in the panel on the left, the output per worker is about 5 times as high in large firms relative to the small firms. This is the comparison of the 200 plus to the 5 to 49 workers in the Indian case. This is productivity differentials on the y-axis. And you compare that to the Chinese case, where you have a similar sort of profile, but all suggesting that productivity is considerably higher. And in fact, the productivity differential in India is even more dramatic than it is in China, suggesting that scale matters a lot for productivity, for competitiveness. This is a well-known set of figures, first produced, I think, by Dr. Rana Hassan, looking at the apparel sector, India versus China in 2005, where a sector that's very important for Indian exports. You see the very, very dramatic contrast there's a sector in which China has done extremely well in recent decades. And you see the extreme concentration in small firms in the apparel sector in India, which is about 92% of Indian workers are in sort of small firms, whereas that number is only about 12%, a little over 12 in the Chinese case, and most of their workers being concentrated in sort of large firms. The consequences for international trade are shown on the slide, where you see kind of a rather different performance in terms of Chinese sales in global markets relative to where India is. And this is an important sector for us to kind of look at and to focus on, and to see the implications of scale and the implications of lack of competitiveness and low productivity manifest themselves so clearly in export performance. This distribution is not unflattering for India just by comparison to China. This profile here shows you a comparison of the size distribution of Indian firms relative to the Philippines and Indonesia and South Korea and so on. And India is clearly sort of at one end of the story, which is by the extreme concentration of its sort of workers in very small and once again low productivity firms. So this is the reason I wanted to mention that, is to say that as far as India's trade performance is concerned, a very big part of that story lies in terms of its own productivity, without even any particular reference to our market access and what's going on with the international trade system and so on. There is a challenge of low productivity. That challenge is, for multiple different reasons. One of those important ones, maybe less commented on in public discourse, has to do with scale, which is why I thought I'd point it out. But the other reasons that I briefly mentioned in reference, having to do with various distortions in factor markets, various challenges within the Indian system, all of which are improving and perhaps have improved quite a bit in recent years. These all remain issues that are worthy of one's attention from a government standpoint, and sort of how to kind of improve things on these margins, and how to facilitate market operations to a greater extent. All right, so with that, having talked a bit about sort of domestic competitiveness issues, let me come to India's trade policy and the world trade system. And in this discussion, I think it would be useful for me to talk a bit about just the trends in the world trade system by themselves. What has been going on outside of India? And how well have we matched our own actions with what it is that has been happening in the rest of the world in terms of the trends in the international trade system? So I'll break this into three pieces. I'll talk a bit about trends in the world trade system, the GATT-WTO system. I'll talk in particular about the evolution away from this kind of very nice rules-based, non-discriminatory architecture that had been set up in the immediate post-war years, post-World War II years, and how the system has evolved from that architecture towards trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements and deviations from kind of the multilateral non-discriminatory architecture that had been set up. I'll talk about the challenges that WTO system has faced, in particular with the failure of the Doha round, which began more than 20 years ago and has not seen successful closure, and the more dramatic challenges that we face today, given the ways in which US trade policy itself has evolved and the rather aggressive positions and postures that US and Washington has taken, both under the Trump administration, the previous Trump administration, Biden administration, that was continued under the Biden administration, and what particular challenges this poses for countries that are part of the system. I'll talk about India's trade policy with reference to the GATT developments of the GATT-WTO, and talk as well a bit about India's sort of trade agreements. For many years, having not really participated in any sort of significant way in terms of bilateral agreements, India signed a few trade deals in the last decade or two, and we'll talk a bit about where, what these agreements have delivered and what we could be doing differently, and talk a bit more generally about sort of future trade policy, what the opportunities are for India in that space. Okay, so let me start a bit with A bit of a background. Most of the audience here is probably well aware of these points, and so I'll be very, very quick. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, signed in 1947, really was a product at one level of the global experience in the interwar years. So between 1919 and 1939, the Great Depression and the rather dramatic failure of international economic cooperation, with countries sort of attempting to raise tariffs in an attempt to kind of offset this kind of declining domestic aggregate demand, using trade policy to direct demand towards their own output and through the use of competitive devaluations. And so the overall judgment, if one looks back, and it was already quite clear back then, that this sort of aggressive use of tariffs and the aggressive use of competitive devaluations really didn't do much other than to prolong what was already a bad economic depression, turning into the Great Depression. And so the U.S., as it emerged from World War II, had in mind, sort of very committed to free trade, wanted to set up a kind of a rules-based international system where it would be difficult for countries to abandon agreements or to raise tariffs arbitrarily or to devalue in this competitive manner to improve their export positions and so forth. And so you got the International Monetary Fund that would sort of essentially monitor some of these issues, in particular with respect to exchange rates. And the GATT emerged as this sort of basic treaty, which would, in a sense, govern, provided the rules through which sort of, under which international trade between the member countries would take place. The GATT was impressively different from most agreements that preceded it in history in one of its features, which is Article 1 of the GATT, which insisted on non-discrimination in trade relations between trading partners. So essentially, this is sometimes referred to as the most favored nation clause. The GATT Article 1 insisting that whatever treatment you give to your most favored nation is the treatment that you would give to all countries, right? Essentially saying you will not discriminate between your trading partners. Whatever imports come in, they should be coming in. They should receive the same treatment, whether the U.S. was importing from Japan or Germany or Great Britain and so on. All of them would be subject, a given good would be subject to the same tariffs. An essential feature of the GATT that was insisted upon by the U.S. And the U.S., in fact, resisted very heavily at the time, pushed by various European countries to incorporate into the GATT some possibility for an exception from Article 1. So the Europeans already had in mind and have this imagination that maybe one day we will integrate, and greater interdependence between our countries, European countries, will prevent wars of the sort that had ravaged the continent previously. And so they did not want to sign on to any deal that would prevent such an integration from taking place, and lobbied very heavily. And these are very interesting exchanges between the European delegations, the delegation of the UK led by Keynes, and the Americans and so forth at Bretton Woods, talking about where the Europeans were pushing for preferential agreements to be allowed, and where the U.S. was pushing back against it. So all this being said, in the end, as much as the U.S. was a champion of non-discrimination in that system, the Article 24 was included within the GATT, which permitted preferential trade agreements, and so in the form of free trade areas and customs unions, provided that these free trade areas were very substantial. So in order to form a free trade area and to kind of deviate from this non-discrimination rule of the GATT by giving trade preferences to some partner country, you had to get into a very substantial trade agreement with a partner involving liberalization of essentially all trade. And that was the intention of Article 24, that if you're going to deviate, you have to do so because you have some greater intention of sort of really deep integration with this partner country. Later on, was included in the GATT something called the Enabling Clause, which diluted this requirement somewhat. And it's a very interesting development that is not commented upon as much, which is that in 1979, the developing countries, for very interesting reasons of history, which we can discuss in the Q&A if you'd like, were permitted to offer preferences to each other, and in particular to get into sort of trade agreements with each other, but agreements that would fall short of the Article 24 architecture, which is to say that you could have very limited trade agreements within developing countries country could wake up one day and say, I would like to liberalize my tariffs on one particular good with respect to some other developing country partner, and that other country liberalizes equally on a handful of goods, and then you could call that a trade agreement, and that would be legal under the GATT. So what you've seen at the GATT is sort of, on the one hand, very broad multilateral liberalization that took place under kind of non-discrimination, kind of reciprocity, and the multiple rounds of trade negotiation that took place under the sponsorship of the GATT between roughly 1950 and 1995. Very substantial reduction in tariffs, very substantial increases in international trade, and this is kind of the wonderful period for the GATT and for world trade. But around that time, the U.S., which had been the sort of principal supporter of this idea of non-discrimination, started to started to look more aggressively and started to get more interested in bilateral arrangements, got into a trade agreement with the Canadians, expanded that trade agreement to include Mexico to form NAFTA. And really, at that point, various other countries around the world started to think about, why it should be the case that they shouldn't themselves look at other trade deals with bilateral partners. And you went from having just really a handful of trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, which are, again, a violation or kind of against the non-discriminatory architecture of the GATT, into a kind of, you had a handful of agreements prior to 1990, and you went from there to having many, many hundreds of agreements today. Every member country of the GATT is part of some special trade agreement, bilateral deal or the other. And the average number of trade agreements that a country's part of is about 7 or 8 at this point. So it's really a dramatic number. So you have here, just once again, an indication of just putting in some numbers on the successes of GATT-sponsored liberalization, a reduction in tariffs on the left scale, an increase in trade on the right scale. And here you see this other picture that I wanted to talk about, which is preferential agreements. So very small number of agreements, really, in terms of operational agreements, which had kind of significant volumes of trade. You're talking about the European trade was kind of the one exception prior to 1990. And you've gone from there to having a very, very large number of trade deals being signed. The one thing I'd point out to you in this picture is that a very large fraction of the trade deals that were signed in the recent decades is that they're between developing countries. This is showing up here in kind of the light blue or the sky blue, one might call it, suggesting that these have all been notified to the GATT under the enabling clause, and suggesting again that the kinds of liberalization one might imagine when one thinks about a free trade agreement is not actually what has been undertaken, because these are developing country agreements, and it could be the case, and it is the case in the context of many of these trade deals, that the kind of liberalization that was undertaken was actually quite partial. Nonetheless, you've had, as we see, hundreds of trade agreements here, a very, very complex web of overlapping trade agreements, and a complete departure, really, from this kind of uniform, non-discriminatory platform that was envisioned under the GATT by post-war years, into what Professor Jagdish Bhagwati very famously referred to as a spaghetti ball of arrangements, multiple linkages, the sort that you see here, where each country is linked to many other countries through a different trade deal with a different set of trade rules, with a different set of rules of origin, and so on and so forth, vastly complicating the picture of international trade. With that, let me turn to Indian trade policy. So very clearly, we had some increase in protectionist measures, turned India into a near autarky by the 1970s. Very, very substantial liberalization, impressive, undertaken in the early 1990s. Everybody here is familiar with the numbers of the highest tariff rates being about 300%, and the simple average being over 100%. That over time being reduced to just over 10%, although these numbers have risen a bit slightly. India's also gotten into some trade agreements in the past, and let me say a couple of words about both of these things. The way that I see some of this, essentially India's trade reforms, is that there's a certain sort of asynchronous feature with respect to what was going on in the rest of the world. So when the rest of the world, which is kind of the richer countries and other GATT members, had liberalized very substantially the period between 1950s up until 1990 and so on, India was, very protectionist, close to an autarky at some point. And just as India began to liberalize unilaterally its trade regime through the reforms that initiated in the early 1990s and started to be integrated more with the multilateral trade system, the WTO system itself started to become less liberal, right? So there's the multilateral sort of trade system started to move more in the direction of bilateral agreements, just as we became fully ready to attach ourselves to the multilateral system. Just as we started to rationalize our trade policy regime with respect to tariffs and non-tariff barriers, trade negotiations at the Uruguay round and otherwise had started to focus. There's a significant feature of trade negotiations with the United Nations, with the United States and the European Union, to focus on other issues, intellectual property rights, environmental regulations, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. And just now, much more recently, as India has started to consider its own bilateral trade agreements, the world is starting to move in a rather different direction yet. So having moved away from multilateral to bilateral, you're now starting to see the beginnings of perhaps the beginnings of a more substantial reversal from globalization altogether. Certainly the developments in the United States, what's going on with Brexit and so on, suggest to you that this process of globalization is slowing. There's a lot of economic nationalist-driven talk about reversals of globalization, reshoring, friendshoring, and so on and so forth. So with that, let me talk a bit about the trade agreements that India got into. So this is having gone through these unilateral reforms in the mid-2000s and beyond, India entered into a set of free trade agreements, right? So the list of free trade agreements is provided here on kind of the left column. But you see as well the manner in which these agreements were notified to the GATT. So most of these, the vast majority here, were notified through the enabling clause, which is to say, repeating myself here, that the kind of liberalization that was undertaken within these agreements probably falls short of what one imagines when one thinks about free trade agreements, which is to say that it's not a very substantial liberalization, and I should take away the word probably that I used earlier. It is in fact the case that the amount of liberalization undertaken within these agreements was quite limited. The consequence of this is indicated in this table here, which is that if you look at India's imports or exports with respect to these kind of bilateral partners, and these are the rows indicated in yellow are the aggregate numbers across India's bilateral agreements, you see that very little has actually changed as you go from the year 2007 to 2017. I just chose kind of a 1-decade period here to see what had changed. And you don't really see a very substantial change, meaning trade within the agreements looks rather different with trade outside of these agreements. It's just a different way of illustrating the same thing year by year, trade profiles showing you that not very much has changed. And so the outcomes under these trade agreements are not what one might have hoped for. And the reasons for this low impact already sort of hinted at, but to say this more strongly now, partial scope agreements, a number of exclusions, liberalization mostly undertaken in sectors with already low MFN tariffs and already low volumes of trade, and low liberalization being undertaken in those sectors where you're actually trading a lot with this bilateral partner. There's also a question of timing. Most of these agreements have sort of phase-in periods. Full liberalization takes place, 5-10 years later, typically 10 years later, and most of the liberalization sort of backloaded. So you end up with 60% of the tariff lines being liberalized at the very end, and so on and so forth. Different agreements are, of course, quite different. But my overall impression, having looked at the details of these trade agreements more closely, is that the ambition already was quite low, and the liberalization was intended to be a bit slow. And on top of everything else, there are quite significant and complicated rules of origin, which is rules that restrict what kinds of goods get trade preference and so on. And so preference utilization is probably quite low within these agreements as well. So on the one hand, unilateral liberalization which India did undertake and undertook at a very dramatic level in the 1990s, perhaps was not helped quite as much by the fact of our low domestic productivity for the various reasons that we've mentioned. Our bilateral agreements have been somewhat limited in their ambition. There was one big opportunity to integrate with this sort of Asian trading partners through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. One of the features of this was China's prominence within this agreement. India had been negotiating with RCEP or possible entry into RCEP for quite a while, and ultimately, I think in 2019, decided not to join. One of the benefits of RCEP would have been that it's a very large market. There's a lot of trade of the global value chain type that takes place within the system. Having free trade with the member countries here would have been very beneficial to India in terms of the ability to participate in a more frictionless way in the GDC system. The other feature about the RCEP, which potentially could have been nice for India, was RCEP deliberately chose to avoid issues that might have been contentious, such as labor standards, environmental standards, et cetera, that are championed to a much greater extent in the US and the EU in their trade deals. But the problem with this, of course, was a fear of sort of greater trade imbalances with China, a fear of sort of trade dependence on China. None of these fears have been alleviated given the geopolitical and sort of the border frictions with China that took place in 2020. And so as much as at one level the RCEP could be seen as a missed opportunity, I see very little prospect of us, even though as I understand it, there's an open invitation for us to join RCEP if we should choose. It appears as if there's a limited likelihood of that happening. One of the other developments in the Indian system has been with respect to unilateral policies, our own tariffs. And while one could have hoped, while I had certainly hoped that these would be lowered perhaps further or rationalized in some way, made uniform, provided greater clarity, and sort of kind of a more systematic structure of incentives for domestic value addition and so on, what you've actually seen in the last few years is an increase in these tariffs. It's gone up from the simple average has gone up from maybe 13.5% to about 18 or so. It's not some super giant increase, but significant enough, and certainly a move in the wrong direction, adding frictions to trade, making it more challenging to participate in global value chains rather than to limit that. We've, of course, negotiated much more recently a number of additional free trade agreements with the UAE and Australia and this European grouping of Iceland and Norway, Switzerland, and so on. I understand, I haven't looked at these agreements closely, but that there's a greater, kind of a broader liberalization that's been undertaken within these agreements, a more ambitious level of liberalization, and perhaps therefore these will yield better outcomes. Having said all this, maybe the opportunity for India, the greater opportunity, because the volumes of trade in these agreements is still quite low from an Indian perspective, would be a kind of an ambitious sort of possibility here would be to consider joining the CPTPP, this grouping of Pacific Rim countries that the US was going to be part of and then exited from under the Trump administration. A very large grouping of countries providing tremendous opportunities for India, including trade with Korea and Japan and so forth, or separately trade deals with the US and EU if there is enough sort of economic and political will within the system to make these things happen. These would perhaps provide a more substantial stimulus to the Indian system and greater opportunities in terms of market access for Indian exporters. So with that, I'm almost out of time. So let me conclude with the following thoughts. One is to say that India's early round of unilateral trade reforms were very impressive, but perhaps succeeded only partially for all of the reasons have kept domestic productivity relatively low, including the issues of scale, various logistical infrastructural challenges, technology, and so forth. India's bilateral agreements have been relatively shallow, limited levels of liberalization been undertaken. Our GVC participation is low. Raising import tariffs recently has not helped this process. We could perhaps do better. on this margin. On the multilateral front, I didn't talk about this too much. Perhaps this will come up in the Q&A, but there are genuinely vast sort of uncertainties about the future of the international trade system stemming from the fact that the U.S. seems to have reversed at one level its interest in the WTO, that it seems to there seems to be a spirit of economic nationalism that has taken over in a bipartisan manner, both Republicans, Democrats in the US, and what this brings, we'll see. Having said this, and having talked about the potential uncertainties, the multilateral system, in my view, still offers India tremendous, tremendous opportunities. If nothing were to change and there was no greater liberalization undertaken at the WTO level, this is still an enormous market for India. This is still offers great opportunities, and you know, we would be well advised to take as much advantage of the opportunity that the WTO system presents as we could. We have seen, and this is for me what gives me tremendous optimism about India, is the very impressive improvements in digital infrastructure, in physical infrastructure, in the business environment, and the move towards sort of a relaxation of the various restrictions with respect to factor markets. And one can hope that these would be accompanied by equally bold moves in trade policy, perhaps some integration with the CPTPP, perhaps with the Europeans through some type of an FTA, free trade area, perhaps through some combination of these with unilateral reforms that make things relatively frictionless at the border, or certainly lower the frictions at the border. This would ensure greater sort of ability for markets to function appropriately in a manner that I think Dr. Shenoy would certainly applaud. And with that, let me stop and take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pravin Krishna. That was very illuminating. Of course, over the years, I have read you, Dr. Panagaria, Dr. Bhagwati, and others in newspapers on talking about similar issues, but that generally gives you 800 to 1200 words of space to make your case. And so, yeah, this was a bit at length. I'm glad to see that there are a lot of questions and queries from the audience. So what I'll do is some of the directly or indirectly, you might have covered a few of those answers, but I'm not going to assume it. And maybe that will give you an opportunity to kind of delve deeper or make other remarks that you would like. So with that, I'll start. The first question comes from username AZD. And he has this question, he or she is, why has productivity in services declined over a period of time? And second part of the question is kind of different, is that should India join trade blocs like RCEP, or will it be against India's strategic interests?
Yeah, so let me actually start before answering the question. Let me start by saying that I'm a faculty member, a professor now, but at heart, I very much consider myself to be still a student. And a lot of what I've said today really reflects what it is that I've learned from the work of others, most notably Professor Bhagwati and Professor Panagari and so on. And if they were watching this, or if they see this in the future, they will recognize both their thoughts and their arguments, as well as maybe some of their slides even being reflected directly in the presentation. So I owe a lot to my predecessors in the field, both on the sort of the academic research side, from whom I've learned a lot, as well on the practitioner side, Dr. Monte Carvalho and so forth, from whose work and from whose writings I've learned a lot, and indeed deeply grateful for that. Coming to the question, so on the RCEP issue, where I think I could be more detailed, it's a difficult challenge for us, right? So on the one hand, it was a very interesting, enticing opportunity. It's a very large market, roughly 1/3 of world trade, and if we had been in a position to join either because of the strength of our own sort of domestic productivity, if we had felt more confident that we wouldn't be swamped in a sense by Chinese exports to us, maybe one could have seen that a little differently. I think quite apart from the geopolitical issue, which is very significant and certainly cannot be diminished in any way. Quite apart from that, there were concerns just about our economic ability to do this in the sense of, can you integrate with China in a way that doesn't completely swamp your domestic producers? It's a reasonable question, right? So as much as one wants that stimulus from import competition and so forth, there is a question of how, our ability to absorb a quote unquote China shock. Various other countries feel, like the United States, feel that they've paid a very kind of large, significant domestic price by having done this too quickly. And so it's a question for policymakers to think about. I had felt a bit positively about RCEP, partially because I thought this would give us that great opportunity to join essentially the global value chains, and maybe there was some way within the negotiation that we could slow down, sort of have some phased in, entry into RCEP, maybe 10 years, 15 years, and so on, figure out some manner in which to negotiate our entry. At this point, because of the geopolitics, and because of what's happened, not just even broadly in a geopolitical sense, but what's happened specifically with respect to India and China in Galwan and so forth, I think the geopolitical question probably dominates, and our willingness to be dependent on our imports on China is probably, uppermost in the minds of policymakers when they think about this particular trade relationship. So I see very little prospect for our joining RCEP. Maybe it's a bit of a missed opportunity, but I don't see much else that could happen in this context. The one thing that we could still consider, and so this trade relationship with China cannot be ignored altogether. We are, of course, trading with China, and even the United States, which now has clearly articulated that it sees China as a major competitor, strategic adversary, and so forth, an adversary, and so forth. Trades a tremendous amount with China, right? So there's a question of whether we can manage our strategic concerns about China and geopolitical concerns with respect to China while nevertheless engaging in international trade, nevertheless engaging Chinese foreign direct investments and so forth. And maybe there is a path here that when you think about those goods where there isn't this kind of strategic concern, when you think about those investments where your national security is not compromised or you're not overly reliant on China and so forth. And maybe the set of goods and the set of industries where these are very heavy concerns are a limited number. And so one could certainly engage China a lot. One could certainly have a lot of trade investment relations with China, but maybe not through RCEP. So that would be my answer to that. On the issue of services productivity, I'm not quite sure I'm well positioned to answer that question. I mean, my understanding of the services sector is that there's a kind of a bimodal structure to this. You have very high level, high productivity, high value add, high wage services, IT, and so on and so forth, where Indian workers are doing, and businesses are doing extremely well. These are subject to high productivity growth as well. And equally, on the other end of this distribution, kind of low wage, low productivity service sector jobs. So what's going on that end with respect to productivity growth? I can only speculate, but I could certainly see if you said, selling chai or selling pakoras or something like that on the street side is a service, which it is, then maybe the manner in which chai was being sold, 30 years ago is the same in which it was being sold right now. So there hasn't been that kind of productivity growth that you see, of course, on the other end of that distribution. So when you aggregate all of these together, maybe there's a compositional effect and you're overly influenced by the other end of the distribution. But I should say that I'm not, I don't know more than. Thank you.
Thank you. We talked a little bit about China, and therefore probably it's better to take the second set of questions from Anirudh. And he asks that all Asian export miracles have generally been dictatorial countries. Probably he's meaning less of a democratic nature. So will or does the world need another China, or is the export-driven growth model over?
Yeah, so let me start with that last piece about whether the export model is over or not, right? So I'm old enough to remember this is the pre-China days when I was a graduate student at Columbia University and we had our seminars on international trade. And by that point, Korea had done very well and Japan had done very well. So these were the countries that had already, in a sense, peaked in terms of their manufacturing and their exports to the US. And people at that stage were talking very confidently that the manufacturing-led export growth was over. Right? They said there's no room anymore. Japan is doing everything, Korea is doing everything, and there's some little pieces left over for region and so forth. And since then, you've had this tremendous amount of change with China's entry and Chinese exports, and really a very dramatic transformation of the Chinese economy to this point, right? So whether the Indian system could equally succeed in the way that China has, bringing hundreds of millions out of farms into factories and out of poverty into greater incomes and so forth, maybe the opportunities have dimmed somewhat, right? So with the obvious presence of China in there, but from an Indian perspective, that would not be my worry, in the sense that we are operating at such a low share. We were at 2%, right? So even if we went from 2 to 4 or 2 to 5, this is great for us. And from 2 to 5, I don't think that opportunity is exhausted. From 2 to 7, I don't think that opportunity is exhausted, right? And so, yes, the opportunity perhaps is not what it was maybe before Korea entered and before somebody else entered and before China entered and so forth. But that opportunity is still there. And improvements in our domestic productivity, and there's a lot of room for us to do that, and improvements in market access and whatever else, mostly domestic productivity here, will give us a huge amount of there's still huge opportunities left within the system. Look at what Vietnam and Bangladesh have done as well, right? So even after China entered, people said there's no more room for anybody else to do anything. And Vietnam has done some good things. The Bangladeshis have done some good things in recent years. So the opportunity is there, whether it's the highest possible level or somewhat diminished. I don't think that's an interesting question. It's an academic question. From a practical perspective, maybe we don't need to worry about it quite as much, right? In the sense that we do what we can, we improve our productivity, and the results will come, and we improve our market access, the results will come. On the issue of authoritarian versus democracies and so forth, this is really above my pay grade as an economist, and maybe political scientists can comment upon that question with greater authority. I will say that certainly in some respects, maybe having heavy hand in the state in the manner that some of these countries have pulled off in organizing their economic activity could have worked over there. This is really an issue that there's not some choice that we face in India in any case. We have a robust democracy. It has its own successes. It grows at its own pace. I think tremendous opportunities are still available to us with our system. And so maybe this sort of alternative of whether things would have been a little different if you had a more authoritarian structure, more able to control things and so forth. Again, an interesting academic question, but just looking at our opportunities from our perspective, I think there's a lot that we could achieve.
Yeah, I think on a related note, and that is the nature of doing things online. The next question is from Anonymous. And the question is, so what is your opinions about Rajan and Lamba's argument about India being able to use services mainly instead of manufacturing for high growth?
Yeah, so look, this argument has been around for a bit now in terms of the policy space. And I will just start by saying that maybe we don't need to frame this debate as manufacturing versus services, right? It does not have to be manufacturing versus services. It's manufacturing and services. I don't see any particular governmental trade-off in thinking about, should we support manufacturing or should we support services? Support both. And, if the issue is let's improve our domestic infrastructure, let's make India a better place to do business, and so forth. These are perhaps at one level. It's a simple way of looking at things. Equally relevant for manufacturing, equally relevant for services. It's not as if on the marginal rupee that one is thinking about, should I put it in services or should I put it in manufacturing? So at one level, I would say we don't need to frame this question for ourselves as a manufacturing versus services. It's all about manufacturing and services. And I'm pretty sure that if you talk to Professor Rajan or if you talk to people on the other side of this debate, they would agree that one does not have to look at this as, this in exclusion of that, to the exclusion of that, or that to the exclusion of this. That said, it is true that Indian manufacturing has been somewhat disappointing. And this was the core of the talk today. And so, it's sufficiently disappointing that one could ask the question about, what hopes could one rest upon manufacturing for the future, right? So I think I've made the argument that a variety of things that we could improve on could help us sort of expand manufacturing, could help us bring workers out of farms into factories and so forth. But let's look at that question from the services perspective, right? I think the argument that many have in mind when they think about services, they have this imagination about sort of the high-end services, right? So you're talking about your IT workers who are very happy and proud of the success of the Indian IT sector and so on. But how many workers out of Indian farms can you transition into those kinds of jobs, right? So those high-skilled jobs that are really symbols of India's success over there. So, when you're thinking about services, one has to be careful about the fact that, it's not as if we have an unending supply of high-skilled workers that can keep on staffing these service sectors that require a high level of skill. But coming back to the question, if the issue is, listen, should we not be also focused on services and manufacturing? In fact, related, there are manufacturing-linked services, there are services-linked manufacturing activities. And all of this is good. So, I don't necessarily see these as this versus that and that versus this. I think we could be doing well on all fronts.
Thanks. Yeah, so most of the debate has been about manufacturing and services, and therefore, probably vis-a-vis or as a complementary or a supplement. So here, therefore, in addition, this is an interesting question from Abhinav Singh, and he asks, what is India's position in trade negotiations for agriculture goods? And what are the main reasons why India is not a bigger exporter of agriculture commodities?
Agriculture, okay, so agriculture is a bit of a complicated sector. And you could think about, let me come back a bit to the kind of the Doha round of trade negotiations and India's role with it, right? So the broad picture with respect to agricultural trade is that you have agriculture as a sector for many, many years was an excluded sector within the world trade system, right? So there was no liberalization that was undertaken. It was not systematically considered. In some ways, it has been incorporated into these negotiations now, but the Doha round was supposed to be the big round that sort of took care of the agricultural sector, right? And what it was supposed to achieve, Doha, from a developed country standpoint, right? So what is the United States supposed to do, under Doha? What are the Europeans supposed to do under Doha? Essentially is to remove or reduce their agricultural production subsidies and the extent to which production subsidies in effect become export subsidies, right? So you want the US to reduce, and I'm going to come to India in a minute, but you want the US to reduce agricultural subsidies, you want the Europeans to reduce agricultural subsidies. The overall impact of that is to reduce agricultural production and to increase prices for agriculture, for food in the world, right? And as soon as you see it that way, you can sort of understand India's maybe reluctance is, there's a complicated attitude that one might have towards agricultural liberalization and agricultural negotiations, recognizing the fact that what you're really asking the other countries to do, meaning the Europeans and the Americans, is to reduce subsidies, raising agricultural fruit prices. Is that something that we want, right? So that might be good for, let's say, our farmers, right? So if you're a farmer or you're on the agricultural production side of things, then those sectors will benefit from maybe those individuals and those, will benefit from the higher agricultural prices. But what about the urban poor, right? So if you're urban poor, you have nothing to do with agricultural supply, you're not part of the agricultural food supply chain, you're only a consumer of food, right? What is going to be your attitude with respect to an increase in food prices? Not going to be a very good one. And if you're urban poor, living close to subsistence level and so forth, a big part of your kind of expenditure is on food. And so rising global food prices, which were potentially a consequence of agricultural liberalization, make it a challenging thing to think about, right? So if I were a policymaker, I would also have a slightly be challenged by this proposition of, how far do you want to go with respect to agricultural liberalization in the form that the negotiations were sort of evolving under Doha. I'm not, again, an expert on the agricultural sector, so I know a little bit less about nuances and details. Each sort of subsector within agriculture has its own concerns and so forth. And I've read a bit about this, but one could see why you could have you could be challenged by this idea politically and for good economic moral reasons. You're out of concern for what rising food prices could do to your own population, right? With respect to agricultural sort of exports and so on, I'm not sure. I mean, India does export agricultural commodities. Maybe it could be doing more. Some of this has to do with productivity. And in this, let me offer one observation, not about India, but the United States, which is that the U.S. in the immediate post-war years, kind of as the GATT was being negotiated and so forth, did not perceive itself to be a country that had comparative advantage in agriculture. In fact, it feared the comparative advantage of the other countries, developing countries in agriculture, and was not unhappy with having agriculture be excluded from discussions at that time. Over time, it's become very clear because of the remarkable productivity of U.S. agriculture, right? That the U.S. actually has comparative advantage in agriculture, which is kind of in a certain sense, a very strange thought. The highly developed country actually could be specializing in agricultural production, but they have remarkable productivity, right? So the capital to labor ratios in agriculture are extremely high and very different from the patterns of production you see in developing countries where labor capital ratios are so much higher, right? And so the kind of productivity you see on American farms is actually stunning. If I've lived in this country a while, you get a chance to drive by farms every once in a while, and you're actually stunned by the total lack of any, you don't see any human beings, right? So it's all machines that are being operated by drones, and these machines are of some scale that I did not previously imagine. And it's no surprise, therefore, that you have American apples now being exported to India. So just imagine how high their productivity must be if they're able to make these apples, package them, ship them all the way to India, and they're able to gain a foothold in the Indian market when we have our own apples, right? So a lot of this has to do with productivity as well. Of course, various things come in agriculture as well about logistics and the ability to support, commodities that are perishable and so on and so forth. It needs an extra element there that people in the agricultural sector might be able to comment on.
Yeah. Okay, so on that related note, the question from Amit on topic of productivity, he has two-part questions. One is your recommendations to make India a developed nation by 2047, and how can India improve its domestic productivity?
These are, in a certain sense, maybe the same question, right? So our ability to be a developed nation, and let's take out, 2047 is a nice goal, 100 years, and a developed country is a nice goal. But just even more generally, right? How does one get better? How does one produce more? How does one become more productive? It's a very long list of reasons, and some of these I've hinted at in already, having to do with on the one hand, distortions in factor markets, the quality of our labor supplies, skilled labor relative to, the stock of our labor force at the moment, female participation in the labor force, anything that has to do with inputs that get into the production process, whether it's land, capital, labor, various other inputs, requires a certain type of investment in the form of, skilling of workers, whether it requires some sort of deregulation of onerous rules that prevent easy access to land or easy access to something else, capital. All of these, in the end, contribute to our productivity. We are victims, in a sense, of policy history. On the one hand, has taken the Indian economy in different directions. I'm very optimistic, nonetheless, about India's future and India's trajectory as we head towards 2047 for a number of reasons, including the fact that all of the things that we've just discussed have seen improvements in recent years, and these are active part of the policy discussion. People are aware of these things, no doubt. I hope that the discussions on these issues are followed by concrete policy actions that push India more quickly in these directions. But I think at one level, the answer is simple, which is that the production function, as the economists like to call it, every aspect in that could be improved. The inputs, the production function itself, greater productivity, better roads, better everything, better business environment. So that's very easy for an economist to be, for you to sit in your office and for me to sit in my office here and talk about. Of course, the actual everything depends on the actual implementation of these. So it's certainly within India's reach. We have the right demographics. We're poised very well. Things feel very different in a positive sense. I mean, each time I come back to India, each time I have come back in the last many years, things feel better. Things feel more improved. It's great. Young people seem to feel that things are going very well. There's various other sort of high points like what's going on in the Silicon Valley of India, established in different parts of the country, the tremendous amount of innovation and the energy of our youth. So at one level, I feel great, but it's also very clear that changes are needed, including at the policy level, for this to happen, for all of these on all of these different dimensions we've discussed.
So the answers in your answer to the question, the things that you touched upon, are exactly part of the question that Girdhar Prabhu asks, and his to maybe you can make a brief remark on that, which is with India's talent basket, progress in computing, how rapidly can we have improvement of actual competitiveness and productivity? And the concept of total factor productivity was rarely talked of, and now finds mention in the budget. So some benchmarks, please.
So sure. I mean, I think we of course we need to improve productivity. We need to improve total factor productivity. We are improving perhaps our total factor productivity and all of the changes that we're already seeing with respect to infrastructure, with respect to the digital economy, with respect to all of the things that India is doing on the side of things will improve our productivity. Is it sufficient that we have a high quality group of computer savvy engineers? We're able to achieve great things on that margin. I think probably not, right? So that's a very thin slice of the labor force overall. We're very proud of their accomplishments, and they've really done tremendous things at the national and at the global level, readily recognizable to everybody. But is that in of itself, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but if the question is that in itself going to achieve for us the kinds of things that we want, then my answer would probably be no, it will help us achieve those things, but it's only a small part of something that is much, much larger. Even just thinking about the labor force itself and the skill set of the labor force, one hears very often, and I'm sure you've all heard this argument, including Mr. Prabhu, that the skill set of Indian workers doesn't match the skill requirements of the employers. And really, we're graduating lots of students at every single level, from schools, middle school to high school to colleges and so forth. Everybody's getting different sorts of degrees, and the actual competency level is below for many workers, and maybe the vast majority of the workers is far below what is indicated on the degree. So at one level, there's kind of a very broad problem about skilling. And again, I'm just talking about the workforce, and what the workforce is able to do. Surely, high-skilled computer sector workers are great to have, and maybe more of them would be better to have. And we are producing more of those year by year. But the problem is a broader one. If we're able to achieve this sort of skilling, again, whether it's in the manufacturing sector, whether it's in the services sector, there could be across the board improvements on all of these things. I think that would be what is necessary for this kind of full transformation, and for us to be able to achieve that very high level of total factor productivity that we're looking for.
Yeah, the thing that you talked about was you driving through rural America and seeing all the capital. And recently, a lot of people have started to make a case that population, rising population is not the problem, but probably declining population for many countries already, maybe even the case of China, India, and others. Among others, even Elon Musk was making that case. I come from the state of Bihar, and traveling whenever I go back to my hometown, I see the median age of an average of an Indian is about 28, 29 years. Median age of a Bihari resident is 21. So the only thing I see is young people all around, nothing else. So Elon Musk, you have a problem, we have a solution. Just take care of the two. The capital factor, productivity, all of that can happen. Cool. So I'll now move to the questions which relates to things related to probably trade agreements, etc. So the question comes from Anishri, and she asks, what role can India play in the multilateral system, especially when WTO is facing an appellate paralysis?
Yeah, so very good question. Let me say something about the appellate body crisis, so everyone's on the same page here. So one of the negative things that's happened at the WTO is that starting with the Obama administration, actually, the U.S. has sort of refused to appoint judges to the dispute settlement mechanism. I'm speaking loosely. This is the appellate body of the dispute settlement mechanism. For a variety of reasons, their own concerns with the way the dispute settlement are going, their own issues about particular technical details about how the dispute settlement works in the cases of anti-dumping and so forth. But it surprised me that for these sort of what I thought were very narrow technical issues that could be resolved with some negotiations, that the U.S. took this kind of fairly big step of saying we're not going to have appointed judges. So this began under the Biden administration. And judges, I think they're appointed for maybe 4 years. I think it's 4 years, maybe 5, but I think it's 4 years. And so after that runs out, you have to step down and you essentially go home, right? So over time, you have reached a point now that the judges are not being appointed, they're not being reappointed, new judges are not being appointed. And in fact, the dispute settlement body has run out of judges. There's no judges left to bench cases at the WTO. This system, this situation has been very convenient for the Trump administration, and in fact, the Biden administration that followed it, because a lot of things that the US has done in the last 7 or 8 years are in fact illegal by the WTO rules and have been, can be easily be shown to be illegal. So if you take a case against the US to the WTO, there's nobody left there, in a sense, to rule against you. So it's convenient to be that you're violating the rules, and at the same time, you're preventing any judgments from being passed against you because there's no judges left, right? So that's a real crisis for the dispute settlement system. And in the end, it reflects the basic reality that if the most powerful members of any organization want to paralyze that organization, then that organization will probably get paralyzed in some ways, right? So I'm at least happy that there is a basic functioning of the WTO and the things that were agreed to at the various multilateral rounds and so forth, that outside of the US's violations with respect to India, with the steel and aluminum tariffs and so forth, which had their impact, but they weren't super great in magnitude, that for most part, India has not been adversely affected by some of these things that have gone on at the WTO. With respect to what role we want to play, or we could play, there are discussions going on about an alternative dispute settlement body that countries opt into. So it's recognized by now that the US does not want this to function, but it could be the case that the Europeans and India, for example, just to pick two, that they decide that they want a separate dispute settlement body and they agree to be governed by the rules of this dispute settlement body. So this is an idea that's been floated by the Europeans. I believe it's on the table at this point, being discussed actively by countries. I'm not sure of the exact status of that discussion. But India could play a role in shaping the rules of that new system. India could participate in that system if it wants to. India could encourage other countries to participate in that system. I personally am not sure, because I don't think I've read much about India's views, certainly official views, on how they see this paralysis of the WTO, whether they themselves want to improve upon things, whether they're happy with the status quo of the WTO. I've had the opportunity to ask 1 or 2 Indian government officials this question about how they see the WTO. Are they happy with the way things are? Do you want changes to take place? Do you want a resolution of these issues? Do you want a new round of trade negotiations? And I have to say, the answer has not always been clear, right? So maybe the way that India sees itself at the moment, it's not too unhappy with, and this is just speculation on my part, with the status quo of the WTO. We're trading to the extent that we want, and markets remain reasonably open to us. And so we see this as an okay situation, maybe, right? But if you wanted to play a role, especially with respect to this dispute settlement, there are active initiatives that are out there. One could be contributing, or one could be contributing to.
So, Dr. Krishna, we are out of time, but there are a lot of questions remaining. So I wonder if you have some few more minutes, maybe 5-10 extra minutes, we can. Okay, so we can then
Yes.
continue. Okay, cool.
Yes.
The next question is from CR_12. I think he's a fan of Cristiano Ronaldo. The question is, would you think that tax carve-outs in BITS bits could play a role in affecting investment in Indian sectors, especially considering how India is a key partner to the BEPS framework?
I have to say I'm not terribly well informed about the BEPS framework or this particular issue of the tax carve-outs and investment. I'm actually, let me pass on that question. I mean, broadly speaking, tax incentives could incentivize investment, but I'm afraid I don't know too much beyond that.
Cool. The next question, directly, indirectly, has come from someone, and this should be a top question given the current political economy around the world. The question comes from Professor Panagaria, I think, and he asks if there is the threat of Trump tariffs.
Well, very good to get a question from Professor Panagaria. But on Trump tariffs, I have to say there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, right? So what Trump has said is that there will be a 10 to 20, he has said at least three or four different things. One is that there will be a 10 to 20% tariff on everybody and everything, which would affect India. Then there would be either an additional 60% or just a 60% tariff on everything that comes from China. That's the second thing. The third thing that he said is that if the American companies decide to leave America and start producing somewhere else, like John Deere, the hardware manufacturer, the tractors and so forth, then they would be their imports back, the American companies' imports back into the US, let's say they manufactured something in Mexico, would be subject to 100% or a 200% tariff, right? So there's a punishment for American companies if they leave India. And finally, that he might replace income taxes in the US altogether with just trade taxes, right? Which at one level seems impossible to do because trade taxes currently account for maybe 1 or 2% of the tax revenues of the US. And so even if you put the maximum possible, that revenue maximizing tariff in the US, that would be probably around 40 or 50%. The revenue generated under that is not going to equal what you're getting otherwise from income. But could he go a bit in that direction? Possibly. So it's the big question of the moment right now in Washington, Professor Panagaria, and it's very hard to say more than that. The only thing I will add is that in 2016, when Donald Trump first became president, during his campaign, he said a number of things about trade policy, which many people, including myself, thought were just sort of campaign speeches, that he was not going to deliver on some of these things, especially with respect to China and some of these other things with respect to India as well. And this willingness of the US under him to invoke national security clauses and exceptions and unfair trading practices, rules, and so forth, to take a fairly aggressive stance with respect to one's trading partners. But in the event, he did so, right? And so what felt unlikely in the December of 2015 started to become a reality by 2016, 2017, 2018. And so as much as some of the things that he's talking about now, like this broad-based tariff on everybody and the high tariffs on China and so forth, it seems unlikely that he would do this. And you ask the question, why would he do this to an ally like Japan or India or somebody else or the Europeans? But the steel and aluminum tariffs that were put on in 2017, they began with his allies. So the tariffs were on Canada, with Mexico and India, on South Korea, and Japan, and the Europeans, and of course the Chinese. So he's not above, using this as an instrument to maybe get some concessions for preferred sectors on allies. and he's certainly not above using this against strategic competitors, quote unquote, like China. So it's hard to see what to make of it. I would fear that he makes good on his promises, but at the same time, we live in a world where it seems like a dramatic, maybe extreme thing to do, and so you're conditioned to believe that maybe it won't happen, and it's just maybe an instrument through which he might seek to extract some concessions from partners.
Yeah, I think he started it to be the deal maker, so we need to be a good deal maker as well when we go on the table. Last couple of questions. Maybe you have touched upon it already briefly. Bhavya asked this, that you mentioned a global shift towards reversal of globalization, deglobalization. So what opportunities, challenges does this trend bring for India?
So yeah, I mean, there's on the one hand, simple economic nationalism maybe is not the best thing for India, right? So if every country said, listen, we've had enough of international trade, which they're not saying, but just for argument's sake, if they said we want to just move back to a different world in which we just produce everything ourselves, we have a great deal of self-reliance and so forth, then that decreases our marketplaces, right? So, but that's not where we are, in the sense that there's been a bit of a reversal. It's not the uniform expressions of desire to cut away from international markets altogether, on the one hand. On the other, the picture is, of course, complicated by the evolving geopolitics, and might potentially, in that context, provide some opportunities for India as well, the very well-known China plus one sort of argument, right? So because of these strong bipartisan consensus, for example, in the US, so Republicans and Democrats agreeing somehow that they want to rely less on China, they want to have less trade with China, and they want to have, friend-shoring, move away American factories, especially critical ones, away from China into friends, and India is fortunately considered a friend in this context. That creates its own opportunities, right? And so both with respect to trade, both with respect to receiving foreign direct investment, we are a more attractive place. We've become a more attractive place in any case, in my opinion, right? So our own improvements, independent of all of this, has made us a better place to be than we were maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so on the one hand, that's happening. On the other hand, you have a push because of geopolitics that creates against China, that creates certain opportunities for India in ways that other countries seem to have exploited well in the recent years, including Vietnam. And so that opportunity is still there for India, and maybe we're able to better take advantage of it in the years to come. So the picture is not a uniform reversal of globalization, which would create a different type of challenge, I think, for India. But we're nowhere close to that. There's some degree of retrenchment, if you will, but maybe even a kind of a movement of the pieces in the canvas in different directions that create sort of opportunities for us.
Yeah. I'm always wary when we talk in aggregate. So, and most of the conversation when we talk about foreign trade is generally about India, China, South Korea, etc. And in classrooms, sometimes we're taught that individual countries don't trade, individuals do, and do what you do best, trade for the rest, comparative advantage, etc. So, in light of that, the question that Subodh asks is, what is the best way to argue for lowering tariffs and freeing trade, and what trade strategy would front load benefits to convince politicians and public?
So what is the best way to argue for lower tariffs, right? So this is an argument that international trade economists have had to think about quite a bit. One of the challenges, really, in terms of the political economy of trade policy, these are old arguments again, is that the people who are generally pushing for trade protection, higher tariffs, are very concentrated, and they're focused in their interests. Generally, businesses that are able to whisper into the ears or scream into the ears of a government asking for the things that they want, and consumers in general, are more diffused, less concentrated. I mean, of course, they see some benefits from lower tariffs in terms of lower costs of imports and so on. And so that creates a challenge, that the powerful vested interests are more concentrated, more able to communicate their interests to government, and so therefore they get their way. So it's a challenge of how do you argue in favor, make the argument in a way that, in a sense, the common man appreciates this. Sometimes you're helped by the fact that, there are intermediate inputs. So on both sides of it, both the consumers of a good and who is the producer of this, these are both producers. And so intermediate input users in India, no doubt, would favor lower tariffs on the use of intermediate input so they can produce their final goods more efficiently and so on. So when you have that type of structure, it becomes a little easier to argue. But I will say, at a very broad level, if you thought about what life was like in India in the 1970s, right, in the 1980s, what were the quality of products that you were dealing with? What is it that you were consuming? What was the quality? What was the price? And how that has transformed itself over the last few decades following the liberalization that we've undertaken. I think at least that story makes it extremely clear, even from a common man, consumer standpoint, if people have the memory that goes back that far, which the young of the country probably don't even remember these times and did not experience these times. But I think it's fairly clear, both in terms of quality, in terms of prices, in terms of the variety of goods that are available as a result of liberalized trade. That's certainly there. Sorry, I've forgotten what was the second part of that question?
What trade strategy would front load benefits to convince politicians and public?
The front loading, it's in a sense the same. It's the same question, right? So, which is, in general, the opponents of lower tariffs are producers that are essentially the import competing industry, and so nothing's going to convince an import competing industry that this is a good thing. Consumers, of course, will see the benefit as they do. So the age-old challenge of concentrated producer interests lobbying the government against the interests of diffuse group of consumers continues to dictate the political economy of this to some extent. And maybe the one strong oppositional force that you have in the country is going to be consumers of intermediate inputs. Like if you put a tariff on steel, then whoever uses steel in production is going to be unhappy, and maybe they push back on this, and they see the effects immediately.
Yeah. So, Dr. Krishna, you have been extremely generous. Thank you very much. Just a couple of last quick remarks. So I was reading Dr. Panagaria's book, the recent book, The Nehru Development Model. And in one of the part, he has, I think, bifurcated the political leadership into two time periods. He calls political leadership 1, which is 1950 to 84. And political leadership 2, which is 85 to 2023. Unfortunately, Professor Shenoy lived in political leadership 1, the benefits of where it is not universally accepted, but economic reforms is better understood and better appreciated, is political leadership 2, but still not completely. We still have to continuously make the case for economic reforms. So hopefully 2024 onwards, or some years very soon, we'll have political leadership 3, when it will be unchallenged that we will have sort of economic reforms as the go-to thing, opening up free markets, etc. So yeah, so this brings to the close the B.R. Shenoy Memorial Lecture 2024. So on behalf of Economic Research Center Mangalore and Center for Civil Society New Delhi, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Pravin Krishna, for such an illuminating talk and engaging with questions from the audience, staying late, getting up early for your talk, all of that. So many thanks also to my team CCS who helped organize this lecture. Good night, everyone, and have a good day, Dr. Krishna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A great pleasure. Thanks a lot.